I spent the last 30 years at the seams myself. I like that expression that S2G uses, working at the intersection of climate, insurance, capital markets, and technology. And really what that means in practice, 10 years as a banker and 20 years as an investor, in some of the things that Parag was just showing on the screen: catastrophe bonds, weather derivatives, both producing and then buying and selling instruments that really look at risk of hurricane, earthquake, temperature, how much wind passes through your wind turbine. And ultimately what that really is understanding probability distributions, looking at how do you parameterize and price the risk in the natural world. And it became clear as I spent more and more time in that industry that those underlying probability distributions were shifting. So I started spending 15 years ago a lot more time at gatherings where people were talking about climates. And most of you have been at a lot of those gatherings, I'm sure. And in the end, if you wanted to synthesize what many of those gatherings look like, you come to this picture. There's a techno-utopian future. And the components that lead to that, or the components of most of these climate meetings, you will probably also recognize. We can solve climate change. A lot of talk about emissions, carbon counting, carbon accounting, cool new technologies and venture, and clear theories of change, things that are exciting, plus, as you heard again this morning, AI. And to me, what has always struck me about these agendas and this work is that it didn't mention risk. It really didn't get into the question of what is happening physically to the climate. What does that mean? And not just risk in terms of those changing probability distributions, but the expression of risk. Where are we today? Now, happily, that's certainly not true of this gathering. Parag and I both got to participate in the asymmetrical risk war game yesterday, which was a very thoughtful consideration of future scenarios. And Parag and Sarah Kapnick were able to walk through, here is what we may see and how would you react. And what Sanjeev walked through this morning was also a very eloquent elucidation of, here is the risk in the world that we live in. But it was always surprising to me that most climate gatherings just glided right by this topic. Focusing on risk is a very powerful thing. It gives you a different perspective. It also reveals assumptions that you make about how you think the world is today, how that lines up with what your personal history was. I met Spencer. We were introduced by a mutual friend, Mindy Luber, who runs an organization called Ceres. They've been trying for decades as a nonprofit to introduce the idea of climate risk into capital markets. And that was an idea that made a lot of sense to me. And she said, you know who else also likes to talk about risk and climate is Spencer. You guys should meet. And we did, and became friends and collaborators. But really, the grounding of how you think about risk is not just about insurance or other financial instruments, but it comes down to a concept that Probable Futures, which Spencer founded, and I'm delighted to have worked with, is climate literacy. All of these climate meetings that we go to need to consider physical climate. And frankly, all meetings that we are now having as people who are leading different industries ultimately need to consider climate risk. But that begins with climate literacy. So I'm going to turn it over to Spencer to talk to you a little bit about that concept and what Probable Futures does.
Thanks. So I come from a background of applied models. I was first a systems engineer. I grew up around Detroit, obsessed with why we had shitty cars and a declining social stability. Figured those were pretty tied together. And I eventually did a lot of different kinds of work, got a PhD in economics, wound up in finance entirely by accident, and wound up being the director of research at one of the bigger investment firms in the world. And in that role, my job was to be basically the enemy of bad heuristics, the enemy of bad models. And so I got to understand, so what is in people's models, and became obsessed with what's not in people's models. What do people just not talk about at all? Doesn't get included, isn't in one of the many, many slices. People talk about their universe or their verticals or whatever. What's left out? And so I started looking at climate change. It's about 15 years ago, like Barney, because I realized nobody was working on it. So I thought I'd go look at the models. And I was embarrassed. I was just shocked. Because A, I discovered how good, how useful, how insightful the models were. And B, I discovered that I actually had a climate model. Everybody in here has a climate model. You're using it to make decisions. It's just that that model is entirely based on the past. That model was nothing will change. That model is Chicago is like this. That is implied was in the past, is now, will always be. And there was a good reason for that. And the reason for that is that for 12,000 years, the climate was stable. And so the past informed the future. So this is the history of the temperature of our atmosphere going back to the dawn of civilization. The first humans settled around 9,500 BCE. And from that time, you had no volatility, basically. You had 1 degree plus or minus in the ensuing 12,000 years. So people got really used to the idea that the climate doesn't change. So we built models, which is like, hey, it'll just stay like this. And those models became implicit, entirely implicit. So I used to live here. Actually, I used to live not far from here. I used to live around the corner from Lazo's Tacos, which is up the road a little bit. And here, Chicago has a distribution of weather. This isn't Chicago, but I picked a random place, has a distribution of weather. So this is, over time, over many years, what would you expect the temperature range to be? I've shown you here, there are some sort of an average days. There's a distribution. This one has sort of a winter tail and not much of a tail in the summer. Wherever you live, wherever you grew up, had a distribution. And you built around that distribution. Same for precipitation. Showers were likely, got more heavy and less likely. And then way out there, there's sort of what we call the 1 in 100-year storm. Each place had a pattern. And we built around these patterns. So first we settled because there was a stable climate. That's why we settled. We created communities. Those communities created cultures. And I'm going to give you an example of this. So this is not just a thing from Etsy. This is a thousands-year-old vase. Okay? And this vase is full of important data. This vase is from Greece. These men are harvesting olives. It tells you what the climate of Greece was at the time, which is that it was olive appropriate. And it contains commerce, it contains relationships, and it tells you about agriculture, which is a culture. And on some places, people then went and built governments. And governments led to industry through infrastructure, physical infrastructure, norms, other patterns, laws. And then you get venture capital. If you do everything right, you get the specialization of we only invest at a particular type of time in a particular type of way. Specialization is the way the modern world works. What does that look like in Greece? It looks like olives. It looks like 20% of the arable land is covered in olive farms that are run in a more modern way. That also tells you that the climate of Greece has been the same for 7,000 years. Why does this matter? Because stability is over us. We are outside the green band. You may not have noticed it, but we powered outside of the green band right when the climate started feeling pretty funky. And so we have 5 relevant periods. Too hot for large mammals, too unstable for settlement, settlement in the green band, and now, outside the green band and warming quickly. So to put those in numbers, we were at 0.5 degrees C, near the middle of that green band in the late 20th century. In the early 2010s, we passed 1 degree. In 2023, we passed 1.5 degree, which is where we are now. We will likely be at 2 degrees before 2040. And what happens after that depends on how successful the S2G conference is. But the likelihood of avoiding 2.5 is extremely low, and the proximity of it is very, very, very real. If you are not planning for a 2-degree world, you're just a derelict planner. So let's be here, in this place, Chicago. I love this, this is on Wikipedia. Wikipedia is Chicago taken from Flight 337. Somebody took a picture, labeled it as their flight. I want you to ask, what is the big assumption here? Barney and I talk all the time about assumptions. What is the biggest assumption in this image? This is data also. The assumption is that the lake will stay right there. That's the biggest assumption. Okay? The Chicago River actually flows the other way from its natural path because of its relationship with the lake. So what's some data that would matter for that? Well, it's the weather in the northern Lake Michigan in the wintertime. So this is from probablefutures.org. We built a nonprofit to make this climate data that was available on servers but nobody knew how to use, available to everybody in a free way. There's a free interface, probablefutures.org. And you can see up close the kinds of things that you saw sort of in big schematic ways on Parag's thing. This is in that place, how many freezing days were there? How many days below zero? Temperature stayed below zero all the time. So in an average year, there were 72. In a colder year, there were 104. In a warmer year, there were 40. It's a range. There are colder and warmer winters. There's a range. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because that was at 0.5 degrees. This is at 1. I'll go back and show you that again. You get a big drop. We're at 1.5. You get yet another drop. What's also happened is this range is really wide now. Why is that? Why do people in Chicago care? Because if that lake doesn't freeze over in the winter, it evaporates all winter, and the lake goes down, and the river can't go the right way, and the sewer goes to the wrong place, and all the pipes that are planned for that level of the lake are messed up. And if you go to 2.5 and you go to 3, oh, it doesn't freeze ever, basically. It's a totally different dynamic. So it'll teach you a little more climate science, a little climate literacy. Every 1 degree warmer air gets, it holds 7% more moisture. That means it pulls it from the ground, holds it longer, can dump it out as deluges. So you get more droughts, more deluges, less mild weather. Why does this matter in Chicago? Well, let's look at a global map of drought. So this is the probability of a year plus extreme droughts. Drought's locally defined, so a drought in Mumbai is different than a drought in Dallas, but every place is suited to its pattern. So what happens as we warm? Well, in the past, everywhere this is a once-in-a-generation drought, 5% chance. But as we went from 0.5 to 1, the frequency of drought went way up. If you're in the pea green there, now it's a 5 to 10% chance. But you get to 1.5, oh, it's a big difference. Why does this matter in Chicago? Well, because 75% of the Latin population in this country, in this city, are from Mexico. This is a target destination for people in Mexico. Mexico is drying out incredibly fast. I know we have a Walton connection. Talk to the people who run Walmart Mexico. Every Walmart in Mexico now has rainwater capture because they don't expect to have access to civic water anywhere in Mexico in the future. Because Mexico is drying out as quickly as anywhere in the world, and that will cause migration. And the people in Chicago should probably be ready to understand that people are going to come join their families. You see what happens at higher degrees of warming? Drought becomes, basically what was uncommon becomes the norm. And so old assumptions are already being violated. This is already happening. And I know you wanted me to talk about my family vacation. And so my wife and I took my mother-in-law and my father-in-law and my wife's family's brothers, kids, and everybody in a big Sprinter van for her 80th birthday to drive up the PCH, drive up the coast of California, right near where Barney lives. Did we do that? Did we take this route? I just want you to look at this picture and see how many assumptions are there. How many assumptions are in this picture about the natural world? Because we could not go. Because the PCH gets washed out over and over and over and over again. So we drove to Bakersfield. Okay? So you might be thinking, boy, that's an insurance problem. And I'm here to ask Barney, is insurance coming to the rescue?
Yes. So I have two pieces of good news and one piece of bad news in response to this question. The good news is I spent Monday and Tuesday of this week in Long Beach, California at the Global Sustainable Insurance Summit, which you could say 1,000 things about that title alone. And I was asked to speak to them about the future of insurance. And one thing I mentioned to that room is that there are many other rooms like this one who are waiting with bated breath to see what happens there. So the good news is people are talking about it. The other piece of good news is I am not going to give you a presentation on the future of insurance. The bad news is insurance is not going to come to the rescue. And that's not really about the future, but we thought it might be helpful to take a look at the past. What do we mean when we talk about insurance? Where did that begin? And why is that not necessarily the answer? So a short history, which I'm sure you'll all looking forward to, of risk pooling and insurance. It starts with the original investment vehicle. And whenever I see this picture, it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Admiral Grace Hopper, a very famous lady for lots of good reasons. And the quote is, "Ships in port are safe, but that's not what ships are for," which is true philosophically, but also true financially. And so if you rewind 400 years, and this is the mode of owners, investors, capital allocators at the time, everything is incredibly dependent upon sending ships out and hoping that they come back. This is where insurance begins, because for every 5 captains that sent out a ship or owners, 4 came back. And that was a problem with the return in their business model. So they sat down to talk about it. They would get together and say, what is it that we can do? This seems like something that is not just bad luck. This seems like something we need to figure out how to share this risk. And they came up with an expression, which is still used in London, which is you would rather have the risk fall on the shoulders of the many than on the heads of the few. And they agreed, whomever was unlucky and did not get their ship to be returned, that loss would be shared by those who had good fortune. Now, as it happens, this picture of this coffee house was owned by a guy named Edward Lloyd. He was the person who had a reputation for ship captains and owners and others gathering at his coffee house. And they would meet and they would then start thinking about what are other factors that we need to consider as we decide what ships we want to cover collectively or not. That leads inevitably, as Spencer described earlier, to specialization. You start listing variables that matter. Who's driving the ship? What's it made out of? Where are the pirates? What's the weather like? And ultimately, what winds up happening is that the owners stop going to the coffee house. In fact, specialists start coming to the coffee house. There become so many that they move to another building. Now, 300 years later and several buildings later, Lloyd's still exists as Lloyd's of London rather than a coffee house. But it's a community of specialists. It becomes a group of people who think about all of these variables and probabilities and outsource it. They remove it. Rather than it being a risk decision made by owners, it becomes an expense, a line item somewhere that's now solved. And that's what happens with insurance. And to this day, Lloyd's actually still describes the market as either marine, which is where it grew up, or non-marine, which is literally everything else, which is 90% of the business. What changes these kinds of behavior are shocks. You send out your ship and it doesn't come back. Sanjeev mentioned this changes behavior in financial markets as well. Only shocks change people's behavior. This is a picture much closer to here. This is a shock that happened here in 1871, the Great Chicago Fire. After these shocks is when people start to rethink about risk. All these brick buildings that you see are a direct result of the Chicago Fire. But so are lots of other things. You start thinking about how are you going to build differently? How are you going to design? This is not a problem that you can just transfer away. The first insurance company in America, here in Chicago, sprang up after some of these big events, these fires. This happened in London in 1666. It happened here in Chicago after 1871. But those insurance companies worked with the community and said, we need to figure out what are we building and how are we building it? And then that led to a series of standards. Storm sewers, power systems, architects, contractors deciding what are the codes to which you need to build. And furthermore, where do you plant? Insurance covers what is outside of those bounds. It doesn't set those standards. And those standards are based on history. So very quickly, if we go back to the picture that Spencer showed you before, if you look at temperature, generally speaking, you're fine, other than if it's very, very cold or very, very hot. The same is true. So building code made sure that you would weather everything up to some level which was seen as safe enough to not worry about. Where the discomfort arises or where the disruption arises outside of that building standard is where then you start thinking about, can I transfer this risk to somebody else? That's historically where the insurance market would step in to deal with that tail risk. But if you start shifting those distributions, or in fact, if those distributions have already shifted, as you've heard today, that creates a problem for everybody. Not just for the building codes and for the assumptions that we've made about what we need to do in all of these cases, but also for the insurance providers. If you used to think that this risk was 1 in 100 and now it looks like more like 1 in 20, that has meaningful implications for you as an insurance provider or as a buyer. So insurance companies don't have a lot of choices in this case. They would like to raise prices, but as most of you know, globally, and particularly here in the United States, that's not an option. That leads to what people refer to as denying coverage. But, if I ask for a cup of coffee for $1 and it costs $3 and they won't sell it to me for $1, that's not them denying me coffee. That's simply saying this is an uneconomic transaction to enter into. And so ultimately what that leads to, and this is a metaphor that is overused, and Spencer and I used it in a piece we published in Fortune last year, of the canary in the coal mine. The bird that you no longer hear, that stopped singing, means the air is unsafe for the people who remain in the mines. And what you're seeing is insurance capacity leaving these markets because it's no longer safe in their original economic proposition. However, there's two more important ripple effects than just that insurance withdrawal. One of this means that that's not factored into all of the other financial equations that arise out of these assumptions. If you're not seeing an appropriate price for whatever risk it is that you want to cover, that price isn't in your budget, it isn't in your forecast, it isn't in your decision making. And therefore, it's not priced into other markets. We have a selection of them here, just examples of things that aren't reflecting the actual change in risk that we've already seen. But this is a limited selection. And frankly, any investment that any of us are considering making is going to be impacted by the fact that you don't really have underlying risk information. That is exacerbated in one other way, which is that historically, in a stable world, you can borrow for 30 years and only buy protection for one, because you assume you'll always be able to get insurance protection from a big and liquid market of options. So you only need to buy it 1 year at a time. But in a world where the trajectory of risk and how that risk is changing is becoming a steeper and steeper slope, making an assumption that you can borrow for 30 years and just buy the protection 1 year at a time, copy and paste that cell over 29 columns and say that's the cost of my protection, which is what we've been doing for a long, long time, that's no longer true. So the insurance industry, rightly or wrongly, doesn't want to participate in a series of non-economic transactions. There's lots of potential paths of futures of the industry, which I'd be happy to bore you with at another time. But there are other people who can't leave. Local and regional governments are inheriting this problem.
So here's a typical week in Texas. The Texas government rejects a rate increase for coastal homeowners. That request was made by the Texas's own state plan that was taking over for the decreased coverage from the private sector, and Governor Abbott issues a state of emergency in the same week. So you have this odd behavior, but it means that people are starting to notice. And so we're going to tell you 3 quick stories about people who notice. So a couple weeks ago, I was invited to speak at an organization called PIPSO in a much less swanky Courtyard Marriott. It is the collection of state insurance plans that are now on the hook as the private sector recedes, and they want help. And yes, the Florida people were there, and the Texas and the California people there, but also we're Massachusetts, which is where I live. And we had a little conversation about how these FAIR plans, you may have heard of, were all started actually around after urban conflagration. They're like, yeah, our problem is actually that wildfire is our new arson. So back to probable futures maps, this is the fire danger days, the change in wildfire risk. And as we went from 0.5 to 1, there was an increase in wildfire risk. But at 1.5, oh boy. And we've been on high danger fire risk in Massachusetts for much of the last year. At 2, 2.5, and 3, the problem is all the plants are in the wrong place. It's that simple. They're the wrong plants for that place. Okay, so if you think that you just look at temperature and distance between people and think that's where I'm going to go, Chicago, Massachusetts, upstate New York, all have problems that you could plan for. Barney?
I was at a board meeting for an agricultural technology company last week. They bought some greenhouses, both in California, which is where I was, but also in North Carolina. And they were discussing with the board a problem. These greenhouses were perfectly operational. They've been used for 30 years. They're being used for this cool new ag tech technology. But the greenhouses were too hot. They're actually installing shades on the inside of these greenhouses, which had never existed, and these buildings, which have been in place for decades. and they're actually installing air conditioning for the greenhouses as well. So all of a sudden, you're taking a technology which has worked very, very well in which to grow plants, and all of a sudden has a new and entirely unexpected problem. So another probable futures map, this is the North Carolina version. This is the number of days over this temperature threshold. And again, if you walk through the past, where we are, or where we were, where we are basically right now, and then the versions of the future that you see, and I would certainly agree with S2G's projection of this is probably what we're looking at, that's a wildly different set of assumptions that you now have to make about the future of whether you even need a greenhouse.
So the last example I'll give you, I think is very poignant for here. For these conferences where people came and talked about sustainability, and we were invited, the Probable Futures team, to talk to the biggest producer and vendor of spices in the world. Okay. And they had a big sustainability team at the spice company, and it was all focused on emissions. So this is where all the pepper in the world is grown. And this is the number of days above 82 degrees or 28 degrees C wet bulb. This is a temperature combination. It's equivalent to 100 degrees Fahrenheit and 45% humidity. It's unsafe to be outside. You certainly shouldn't work. It's the hottest, grossest day in Houston. One day a year might reach that in the past. And you can see where that box is right located where most of the pepper in the world is grown. And in the past, there were just 3 days a year like this. But at 1 degree C, that range now is from 0 to 40 days. In a warmer year, it's 40 such days where it's unsafe to be working outside. At 1.5, it's now 0 to 54 days. So these ranges get wider. I don't know whether it'll be good or bad for the peppers. I know it will be very bad for the workers, for the people who grow and harvest and work outside and dry these plants outside. They had not thought about it. They had come to conferences like this and said, we want to be good corporate citizens. They had counted all their carbon. And all their workers are outside getting hotter and hotter and hotter. Okay. There's a way in which the mitigation pathology has been so deep that we stop talking about climate change. And we can incorporate it into decisions. And the first thing for you to ask yourself is, what have you assumed? What are you planting in your garden? Are you going to leave your house to your kids? You're going to tell them, yeah, we were the last people to live here. The Cape's going away. You're going to have to find a new spot. Do you know the risk for your community? Because the community is the unit of observation here. It's not the individual household. It's the community. Are you committed to living there, or are you going to follow the arrows to Wayne County, Michigan? Is the solar farm you're financing vulnerable to hail? Because if it's wrecked by predictable hail, it would be a good idea for the investors to sue you. How do you think about people in the poor and hot places? Both Sanjeev and Parag talked about all of this is downstream from values. And so we need to consider different data and different models. We need to understand who owns what risks. Know the insurance company can only do so much. But there are opportunities to work together, to pool new risks. We need new coffee houses. That's what these can be, is a chance to get together and figure out how we're going to hold each other's risks, how we're going to figure out together how we help the people for whom it goes badly, and how we put resources in places where they go well. This is a communal activity. It's a communal gathering. They have actually much more varied wardrobes, you may notice. But I really want to encourage you to do this. I want to thank you. Again, it's a nonprofit initiative. If you would like to support us philanthropically, we'd be very grateful. We have newsletters and a very non-intrusive climate literacy program if you follow the QR code. And if you would like us to help you do this teaching in another community of any kind, this is what we do. So thank you to S2G for inviting Barney and me. Thank you to all of you for attention. Have a good day.